So I'm not a political pundit. I don't think people will really care what I have to say about politics. And I'm not talking about politics today, but I am talking about the MoCA. And why would you care about what I have to say about a MoCA? First of all, what is a MoCA? The Montreal Cognitive Assessment. We've actually been using that for years because we've been doing work in terms of cognitive decline, Alzheimer's. And as many of you, maybe most, maybe all of you know, the MoCA hit the news again when our president, Donald Trump, was bragging about his perfect score on it. Now, again, few other docs, not many, but a few other docs use some cognitive assessment, but that's the MMSE. It's a different thing. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I'll talk with you. As we go through this, I'll give you my perspective as someone who works routinely with the MoCA. And what does it really mean for Trump and for us? Well, the MoCA, again, stands for the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. It's a brief screening tool for cognitive impairment. It was developed by Ziad Nesreddin, the first author on this article. You can actually watch a MoCA test being administered on the internet. Right here, click on this link. And you'll see the actual components. You'll see an actual patient taking the test. In terms of the components, I've covered that before in other videos. You have tracking like 1 to A, to 2 to B, to 3 to C. That's some executive function type of things. You have very simple, identify this animal, lion, rhino, camel. Draw this 3D box. So you continue to have some basics in terms of looking at how your brain works. Now, I mentioned some other docs. Here's where other docs often will do cognition exams. It's the MMSE, and you'll see it mostly in Medicare Advantage. It's one of the requirements for quality evaluations with Medicare Advantage. You see MMSE much more because it's about a 3-minute exam, like 9 or 10 questions, compared to 3 minutes compared to 10 to 15 to 30 to do the MoCA. Now, there have been comparisons of the two. The MoCA does have significant advantages. It goes deeper into executive function. If you look at things like evidence on stroke, it's much more clearer if someone has had a stroke by looking at the MoCA rather than the MMSE. MoCA and the mini-cog, or MMSE, are not the only ways. There's also just the very simple draw the clock version. I've got a video on patients with congestive heart failure, and it talks about cognitive decline and problems with drawing the clock. Drawing the clock is really easy, unless you've got cognitive problems. And as you begin to see, these are some different versions of problems that you'll get. You'll see big gaps in areas where the numbers needed to be. You'll see one hand on the clock instead of 2. You'll see the shorthand and the longhand confused. And again, numbers can go anywhere. So there's 3 different ways that we've mentioned so far. The MoCA, the mini-cog, or MMSE, and just a simple clock drawing test. And there's comparison science between all of these. Why did this make the news again this time? Political reasons. You look at this Fox News poll, the 2 political contenders for president for next year, and one of the issues is cognition. But again, I'm not going to voice an opinion in that space. The question is, does that perfect score on the MoCA mean that he's really smart? No, this is not an IQ exam. The Montreal Cognitive Assessment, MoCA, test discussed by President Trump and Chris Wallace is, quote, not an IQ test. That's a quote by Dr. Ziad Nesreddin, the guy who created the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. There's another guy who was a psychologist, made a comment, not so complimentary. He said, I'm a psychologist. I've administered the MoCA test hundreds, if not thousands of times. Let me tell you, bragging about acing this test is the equivalent of bragging that you tied your own shoes this morning. Well, again, I've given the MoCA, and no, it's not a thing to brag about if you pass it. There's studies that show about where this is. If you look at 70-year-olds, for example, and above, about 30% will start showing some challenges, score 27 or 26 or less. So yeah, there are some numbers here. In this one, 31% of participants scored below the cutoff, 26 over 30. So again, it doesn't mean that he's a genius, but it's a little bit more than tying your shoes in the morning, especially if you're 70 or 74 like he is. But what does this mean to me? I have to tell you, my brain goes somewhere else, and it has to do with this whole question of why a physician focused on prediabetes would get into cognitive decline. Have you ever read a book, The End of Alzheimer's? It was written by a physician named Dale Bredesen. I remember doing a 2-day training program with him, and he came up afterwards and asked me what I thought about the training program. I said to him, I was surprised. Out of 2 days, you only had about an hour, hour and a half on prediabetes. He said, yeah. And I said, so I thought way over half, and I was being very conservative at that point, I thought way over half of Alzheimer's was due to prediabetes. He looked at me funny, he said, no, probably all of it's due to prediabetes. Even if there isn't documented prediabetes in the body, it's CNS, meaning central nervous system insulin resistance, or brain insulin resistance. You ever heard of that? Brain insulin resistance? What is that? Well, here's a Nature magazine article about brain insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes and Alzheimer's disease, concepts and conundrums. Here's a little bit more detail out of that article. Brain insulin resistance can be defined as the failure of brain cells to respond to insulin as they normally would, resulting in impairments of synaptic, metabolic, and immune response functions. In other words, yes, your brain can become insulin resistant. Now, am I saying Donald Trump's brain's insulin resistant? No. My concern is not so much that one individual. My concern is all of us. And insulin resistance is inextricably linked to loss of our cognitive function. We used to think that these things were like, quote, normal aging. They're not. Now, am I saying that the president doesn't have prediabetes? No, I'm not. In fact, he raised this issue himself a couple of weeks ago. He was announcing a much needed break on prices for insulin. And he said, I don't use insulin. Should I be? Yeah, the English is kind of messed up, but that's a direct quote. I don't think he has diabetes. I think it would probably be out if he does. But I do think he probably does have some carb metabolism impairment. Look, he's age 74. He's got excess body fat. We all know that. And we can all see his dietary habits. They're a challenge. But again, my concern's not the president. It's the rest of us. Type 3 diabetes, the linkage between brain dysfunction and insulin resistance. Processed food, high fructose corn syrup, juice, sodas, high carb diets. These things are linked with obesity, cardiovascular impairment, diabetes, and aging. And those are all very much linked to Alzheimer's. And that goes through increased oxidative stress, mitochondrial dysfunction, increased inflammation, and elevated amyloid beta levels. We'll get a little bit deeper in terms of that. Yes, it has to do with cardiovascular inflammation, oxidative stress, increased AGEs. You ever heard that term, AGE? We've used it several times. It stands for advanced glycation end products. It is basically where glucose has become covalently or permanently bonded to proteins. That's because your glucose levels are too high. An AGE, advanced glycation end product, that I bet you've heard of, even if you didn't know it. The most commonly known one is hemoglobin A1C, or glycated hemoglobin. As you start getting deeper in terms of these bioindicators, again, you begin to see the relationship of those with impaired insulin signaling and cognitive decline. Again, going back to that same theme of Alzheimer's disease and the link to diabetes and insulin resistance. For those of you who get more to the cellular level, you're talking about the astrocytes, the microglia, the neurons, the parts of the brain that, the functioning cellular parts. And you say, look, no, there's inflammation where astrocytes and glia may actually even burn up and damage the neurons. Yeah, there is, and that does happen. And yes, that's very much associated with the inflammatory process that you see with prediabetes, that you see with cognitive decline. Type 3 diabetes and mitochondrial dysfunction. For those of you who are focused on mitochondrial dysfunction, yes, mitochondrial dysfunction is very much a part of this. Aging, hyperglycemia, overloaded free fatty acids, increased body fats, and diabetes, insulin resistance, and Alzheimer's. The pattern goes on and on and on. For those of you who are more focused on, you say, no, wait a minute. It's amyloid beta. It's neurofibrillary tangles. It's tau phosphorylation, oxidative stress, AGEs. You see that pattern going again with those biomarkers and the links between insulin resistance and neurodegeneration or Alzheimer's. And let me just say it one more time. If you think, no, it's amyloid beta, it's not diabetes, go back and look at the actual metabolic pathways. They are linked. So the facts, the models, the hypotheses go on and on and on as we try to get our arms around this devastating disease that's having a huge impact on America and the rest of the world. No matter what the theories, the end result is still the same: significant brain damage. So what can we learn from this? Well, I would strongly consider, get a Kraft insulin survey, try a Freestyle Libre or a Dexcom 6. Know your glucose, your carbohydrate metabolism. Get an inflammation panel. See, these things are key missing data for your health indicator dashboard. Make sure you're healthy. You can call us at 859-721-1414 or email us at myhealth@PrevMed. Thank you so much. So I'd like to talk with you a minute about the webinar. People don't understand what the webinar is. It's actually a great way to get some access to healthcare that you're just not going to get any other way. You actually get the lab tests yourself at a local lab, a Quest lab near you, for the inflammation panel and the OGTT and the insulin survey. These are things, inflammation and prediabetes, that your doctor just does not know about. And here's the thing. Harvard Health and many others have said, look, sudden death is not always so sudden. The Hollywood picture that it's a bolt out of the blue is not realistic. It's more like real lightning, preceded by clouds, wind, and rain. Stop that metabolic storm before the lightning strikes. And here's where that metabolic storm comes from. It's inflammation, and it has to do usually with prediabetes. So again, we actually get labs, we go over them in the webinar, and then you can start finding out how you can prevent that heart attack others said that you couldn't even predict. We can show you how. Thanks.